Happy Pride Month, and welcome back to the No Matter What Club. In today's episode, Paulo and I welcome my good friend and dear mentor, Dr. David Fawcett. Dr. Fawcett is a distinguished psychotherapist and certified sex therapist, and internationally recognized expert on Chemsex, the fusion of drug use and sex. He has over 3 decades of experience in addiction and mental health, and has become the leading authority in supporting individuals in achieving both chemsex sobriety and integrating healthy sex and intimacy into recovery. Dr. Fawcett is the author of the award-winning book Lust, Men and Meth, and also Sex Under the Influence, and he frequently presents at workshops around the world on topics concerning addiction and co-occurring mental health issues, particularly those related to long-term survivors of HIV. His work has earned him numerous accolades, and his compassionate approach and extensive expertise continue to inspire and support individuals and professionals navigating the complexities of chemsex and recovery. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Fawcett.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the No Matter What Club. We are so excited and honored and privileged to have the guest that we have on the episode today. First, Mel. Actually, Mel, do you want to introduce our guest? Because I know that you two have a very close personal and professional relationship.
I mean, I would love to. Dr. Fawcett has been working in the industry for, I think, over 30 years, and working specifically around chemsex, HIV care, sexualized drug use. And I mean, an extensive history. He's written 2 books, Lust, Men and Meth, and then Sex Under the Influence, and, a great mentor and friend of mine. So that is an introduction of many, but Dr. David Fawcett is joining us today.
Hey, Dr. David Fawcett.
Hey, what a pleasure to be with you both. Thank you.
So you're not in the studio today. Where are you currently located? Where is your?
I'm where I live, which is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. In Wilton Manor.
In Wilton Manors. Yep. In the heartland here.
Yeah.
The WeHo of Fort Lauderdale.
One little blue dot in a.
We appreciate the
in a
blue
red state.
Yeah.
I did some damage in Fort Lauderdale during my meth ambition era.
Yeah, a lot of people have. It's a big problem here. And in fact, it was such a big problem. The police chief reached out to me and said when they do traffic stops on Friday and Saturday night, 1 out of 2 cars has methamphetamine in it.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
Here, as it is everywhere.
Right. And I mean, I'm not sure about the state of Florida, but are there available resources for people struggling?
No, not really. There are a lot of treatment centers like everywhere that claim not only LGBTQ friendly or competence, but some chemsex knowledge. And as I'm sure we'll talk about today, and you guys already know, chemsex is a whole different animal, and a lot of the drugs are unique in how they affect the body, and so I think there's a lot of need. I'm one of the things I'm doing in my spare time here is we're putting together a community-wide meth intervention project, and we've secured quite a bit of funding for it. So it's going to be a multi-site.
Wow.
Everything from public outreach, harm reduction rooms, treatment, housing, if we can do it. So we're trying to just really all the levels of care and all the problems that go into creating the issue, trying to address. So first,
that's amazing.
Congratulations on
that's
that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm actually giving a presentation tomorrow on the difference between what I would consider LGBT friendly and LGBTQ affirming treatment. And one of the things that I'm talking about in the presentation is, the whole process of what it looks like to treat someone with an affirming lens rather than considering LGBTQ friendly. So, like when we have someone call the admissions line, we ask them, how they prefer what their preferred pronouns are, what gender they prefer rooming with, what gender they prefer, giving a urine analysis, and that's
Beautiful.
just the beginning of affirming treatment.
Yeah.
And a lot of places, especially here in California, I'm not sure if you see it there in Florida, is they say they're LGBTQ friendly, and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And it's usually they have one queer person running a group, or
Exactly.
there's not
Exactly.
really the considerations. I'm like, well, how do you navigate a conversation with a newly diagnosed person with HIV and their family, or how do you, navigate a conversation with a trans or non-binary individual when their parents are referring to them as their dead name, and all of these complexities that go with treating the queer community. How do you navigate that? Because there really is, I call it a dance, but it's a finesse, right? Of
Yeah.
how you navigate the family dynamic, how you navigate the treatment dynamic, and there are several programs in the country that do address these specific needs. But what I'm really excited about, and what I think separates us in the industry, and is our approach to chemsex and sexualized drug use, which Mell has developed and created, and I know that they get a lot of their inspiration from you. So I'm so honored to have you here, and I am happy to say that I've read both of your books, and I do,
Okay.
it really is, it's a beautiful resource.
Yeah.
To the queer community, especially gay men. I mean, I'll have, I have 9.5 years sober. And for me, when I got sober, I didn't have a place where I could go to treatment and say, that, I was a sex worker. I was hooking up in bathhouses. I, lived the lifestyle that as a circuit boy, circuit man, and finding a treatment program where I could talk about these things and open up and be genuine and sincere, and really try to like uncover, discover, and discard everything. There wasn't that option available to me, and so we find working in this industry and specializing in this kind of treatment, it really does open up the door for a lot of chemsex addicts to be able to find home
Yeah.
and really just navigate the treatment process.
Yeah, and get what they need. And I'm so curious for you, David. How did you end up here? You have chemsex and sexualized drug use. What was kind of your arc or trajectory that led you to this place?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is totally by accident. Uh, I'm in recovery myself from alcohol. It'll be 45 years in May. Um, yeah, I was in my 20s, in New York in 1979, 3 years before the first AIDS case. So I had 3 blissful years of recovery in which my disease was all about internalized homophobia and not accepting myself, and a lot of stigma and just all that stuff that we know well. And really, I came out in gay AA, and they kind of saved my life in many ways. And then there's some really dark days in New York. Um, Ended up in Florida in the late '80s, and working in treatment. In those days, I didn't have I have an MSW now and a PhD in sexology, but in those days I had neither. But you could do treatment, kind of, they call it coffee cup therapy, right? I was in recovery, and there was no regulations. So I was kind of went in, and I had caseloads and therapists and the whole thing. But anyway, gradually I got tired of addiction. I burned out. This is the cocaine epidemic in Florida, and the crack cocaine has followed that. And I got tired of addiction and went back to school when I got my clinical degrees, and decided to become a sex therapist to kind of get out of addiction work. And that's what I did. I studied sexology. My dissertation was actually on crystal meth because it was all around me. But my intention was to work as a sex therapist and open a private practice in Lauderdale in the '90s. I was director. We had a Pride Institute unit here at that time. I was director there for a while, and opened a private practice serving largely in my own community, which was gay men, and my own. I was also diagnosed with HIV in '88, diagnosed positive, so that would also influence me a lot and kind of hijacked my 30s and 40s. But what happened when I opened my sex therapy practices, I started getting a lot of gay men with sexual problems caused by methamphetamine, right?
Right.
So it kind of came full circle. There it was, and I had, I think, a unique combination of training with the sex therapy piece, the addiction recovery myself, the clinical piece. And I started kind of putting it together. And I was desperate for anybody else doing this work. And it was like silence that I
Yeah,
couldn't
that's what
find
I mean.
anybody.
You
There
were,
was no protocol. There was nobody to talk to about it. And so I just kind of gradually put it together, uh, probably on my own for a good 10 or 15 years. And
Wow.
my friend David Stewart in London coined the term, started seeing this more, and gradually it it happened. And then the book came out in 2015. So and then it really kind of has exploded, both the level of the problem and the resources we had to deal with it since
right.
then,
Yeah.
which is a good thing. But yeah, it was a kind of a strange, crazy journey, but it's been incredibly powerful, and uh, so many gifts along the way coming to me from this work. I can't tell you. So it's been beautiful work.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
When I hear about you being, having an HIV positive diagnosis in the late 80s, I'm sure that was really challenging for you to navigate. Do you mind going into that a little bit of like what that experience was like for
Sure.
you?
Um, yeah, I was in a monogamous relationship. We had been for 6 years. So we both tested positive. I was positive longer than that. But at that time, I was still in the era of prepare yourself because you got tops 2 years,
Yeah.
that kind of death penalty, if you will. Um, and very quickly, I mean, I started getting all these uh, opportunistic infections from different brain infections and uh, kidney and liver toxicity, all this crazy stuff. I went on AZT, which was as bad as the virus itself, until 94. With the bottom for me was I had non-Hodgkin lymphoma. I
Oh my gosh.
nearly died. My parents were called from the Midwest where they lived, and they showed up, and that's how I learned I had HIV, because that was such a big stigmatized secret. So it
Right.
was really this kind of cathartic and quite horrible moment in the hospital room when they expected me to die.
Wow.
And I pulled through. And then the very next year, protease inhibitors came out, which are the second class of, we know now we need three different classes of drugs
Right.
to suppress the virus. And they came out in 95. And 95, by the way, and this ties to crystal meth, because in 95 was normally the protease inhibitors come out, but crystal meth really kind of arrived on the scene,
Right.
as did Viagra, kind of the perfect storm. And what I was seeing here in Florida, same thing in say Palm Springs or Key West or other areas, we saw a lot of gay men giving up their lives wherever they were, coming here to die,
Right.
and they'd come here to die, and most of them didn't, right? They started living, and I have friends very consciously talking about this. Well, and here I am. I've thrown away my life. I've ran out my credit cards. Have really no responsibilities. And here's this party drug. I'm gonna live, man. I'm gonna party. And that's what they do. And so we see this kind of direct link between
Yeah.
early days of the HIV epidemic right into the meth as a way to just cope with this kind of horrible virus that had descended on the community. And that, by the way, was my motivation in the beginning. Too, was like, what the hell, if I may say that to those
Yeah,
who
of
said
course.
something else. But it's just people surviving AIDS just to succumb to this
Right.
drug, and
That's
that's still
heartbreaking.
happening.
Yeah, it is still happening. You're very right. Like that internalized stigma and in the community and outside of the community still exists in a lot of the guys that I talk to. I'm like, wow, yeah, we're at U equals U and undetectable and like remarkable, progress made as far as treating HIV, but people are still
Yeah.
holding on to the shame that drives addiction.
I was kind of stunned when I started doing this work with the guys in the early days there in the late 90s, where we talked about native core beliefs that they were caring about themselves. And the one I started to hear consistently was, I feel like damaged goods,
Yeah.
right? And that belief that just there's nothing positive about me. I'm an addict, right? I have HIV, and I'm gay. Just it was this kind of burden of kind of stigmatized identities. And the thing about that that's kind of, know what the right word is. I have dismay about it, is that I still have a lot of clients who totally believe I feel like damaged goods.
Yeah.
To your point, Mel, right?
Yeah.
This is 30, 40 years later, and that internalized stigma is still very much alive.
Right.
There's two things that this conversation has brought up for me. One is we treat a lot of people that have survivor's guilt. You know, if they're in that demographic of being out in the late 80s, early 90s, that have had the ability to kind of live now and are seeking treatment, that is one of the things that we deal with a lot is like, you know, I buried all of my friends.
Yeah.
And that definitely we do see that does increase people's susceptibility to using. And the other thing is when I got sober, I started talking about my HIV status publicly a few years ago because of the shame that, you know, that was associated with it. But, you know, when I found out I was HIV positive, I was 17 years old. And my addiction, I'd left my parents' house when I was 16. And this was in 2006. So I've been HIV positive for over half my life at this point. And my viral load was over 1 million. I had 14 T cells. They were putting me, I was on Bactrim, which was a medication because my T cells were below, I think, 250 at the time. And so I was, you know, to prevent pneumonia and all of these things, I was on all of these medications. And as a 17-year-old boy in 2006
in the South.
Well, I just left New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina and had gone up to Chicago. But yeah, I mean, I remember like going on dates, right? And I would be like, I'm even in this sobriety when I got sober in 2015. I had testicular cancer, and I was like, so was me on a date. I was newly sober, trying to get back in the workforce, had nothing to offer, have been HIV positive for, so many years. I had my teeth falling out. I was like, date me, love me, pick me. And I was just a piece
look at you now, come on.
And I was a piece of work, but like, I totally relate to that damaged goods kind of mentality because, we even see it, we were seeing it on the apps at the time when like, are you clean? Or that language, and it's like,
Absolutely.
that stigmatizing language is really just, especially for somebody who's newly diagnosed or trying to come to terms with their diagnosis. Those kinds of, that kind of verbiage is really just,
it's damaging.
It is. It really is.
Well, and it's more damaging because it resonates with what we already believe about
right.
ourselves, right? It's like, oh yeah, this is external validation of my belief that I'm damaged goods or there's something terribly, terribly wrong with me, and it's just, and and as I say, we still see that today, along with, you mentioned, Paula, that losing everybody. I think most of us from that era lost partners as well, and just that survivors thing, but that complex grief, right? That's still there.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, like, our parents or grandparents, that might have gone to World War II, right? All those stories about they never talk about it when they came back.
Yeah, it was never talked about.
No, and I think that in many ways, those of us that went through those dark days don't really talk about it much. And now there's not a lot of people to talk about it with that kind of identify, but there's still plenty. But I think it's kind of a remarkable thing that we haven't really put that out in the open yet. And that, I think that's another thing that makes us really vulnerable to addiction and powerful drugs that can take us to a different place.
Eliminate shame.
Disconnect from all that.
Eliminate shame. Yeah. And, I remember when I was diagnosed and I was on my medication and, my numbers started getting better and the sores and the thrush started going away in my mouth and, I was able to like go out in public. I had an elder look at me and say, I appreciate this very much, like, do your research and see what people had to go through in order for you to be able to receive this medication. And if somebody hadn't educated me, I don't know that I would have appreciated the journey that you were on and that everybody that had, was the ACT UP and all of the, all of the fighting and picketing and all of the things that people did in order for us to be able to have the medications that we have today. So thank you for being on the front lines for as long as you have, for someone like me to be able to get the medication that I need to live a big, beautiful life today.
Yeah, and I mean, I love definitely honoring the shoulders that we stand on, right?
Sure.
And that type of history, that's not something that we're just going to pick up a magazine and read.
No.
Like, it is something that requires education. I think with more education, it boosts resilience, and people have a sense of pride, right? Because we came together during that time as a community more than we ever have, right? And it brought us together.
It's such an important point, Mel, because I don't dwell on the horrors of that, right? But I was in New York City. You'd see these young, beautiful men who were done in 90 pounds, who were blind from mycobacteria, who were having really bad dementia all of a sudden, and were dying really quickly. You call a friend you talked to, had coffee with last week, and somebody else answered the phone, they were gone. But in terms of community, who stepped up, right? It was the lesbian community stepped up. And it was the lesbians that really cared for and really walked a lot of gay men to their end. And I just am eternally grateful for that. And those are stories that we don't hear a lot about. But you're right, the community was very much unified, even in terms of backed up. It was a powerful impetus to really try to do something and take whatever control we could, back.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a hugely significant era that I think we still, the reason I kind of wanted to go into a little bit of detail about it is because I think we still see so many strains of it living in the strata today, that we don't maybe not recognize if we don't really look for it or aware of it in our clients.
Right.
It's there.
Yeah, and I think, in the chemsex crisis of it all, it's like, okay, here's our second epidemic. We're losing relationships. We're losing, beautiful people all around, and especially the impact is disproportionately on gay men. And I've watched people just kind of crumble. And when I think about it, I'm like, what kind of community action or community call can we put together to address this? Because, in the same, not the same way, but similar, HIV lived in the shadows, right? And it wasn't talked about. And it wasn't, there was no education on it. And I feel like it's almost the same with chemsex sometimes. It's like, oh, you go out and party, you do coke, you drink. Okay, that's acceptable. But don't tell anyone that you actually are addicted to meth over here on the side.
It's
right?
not something that we
It
could
lives
talk
in the
about
shadows as well.
party.
Right? Yeah, nobody's talking about that.
Yeah, it was very like, oh, let's do some ketamine, ecstasy, Molly,
Socially acceptable drugs.
Right. But, if you were doing Tina, or if you were doing crystal meth, you were on the other side of the other side of the circuit party. Well, if you ever made it to the circuit party.
That's right. I don't know a lot of tweakers that made it to the circuit party. Let's be honest here.
For those who did.
Yeah, for those who did. But that type of shame and stigma exists internally.
Yeah, that intra-community stuff, right? I mentioned it in Lustman and Meth. It was an actual experience of seeing these older gay guys in a bar, really, really drunk, falling off their bar stools, talking about guys who would use meth. It's like, oh my God, how could anybody do that? It's another addiction, right? But there's such stigma. There continues to be such stigma about that, and that just drives it in the shadows.
Right.
Again, right? There's still.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're so excited to have you on to talk about this, especially during the Pride season and all of the things that are coming up. And I think that I've said this on a few episodes, and I'm sure throughout the Pride series we're going to hear a lot of this. But like for me, for years, I thought Pride was a circuit party. It's until I got sober and started talking to people and doing some research and reading some books and talking to people that are educated in the community and being able to have beautiful conversations like these, where I get to honor, like you said, the people that came before me and fought for us to be able to have these rights and to be able to hold my husband's hand in the street and to be able to have the HIV medication that I have today, and even the clinical work that we're doing to treat chemsex. I mean, you were at the forefront of a huge part of our curriculum, and so it really is an honor to be able to have you here. One of the things that I hear Mel talk about a lot, that I'm interested to ask you, if you don't mind, is Mel always says that crystal meth is a shame killer. is, when we have so much shame in our community, is that one of the contributors to why crystal meth is so prevalent within the community?
Yes, and it's short. And I think shame is an emotional layer, if you will, that runs through all addiction, but it's particularly so with meth. And I think it's compounded by the fact there's a sexual component with chemsex. We have a lot of shame about that as well. But yeah, I think that shame is strong and lives, and I have a lot of clients, who talk about, I have no shame. My husband goes to the office Christmas party and we hold hands and all that stuff. But if we start drilling down a little bit into how they feel about themselves, especially, there's often a lot of buried shame in there they're not even aware of, kind of internalized hormone negativity, if you will, buried deep. And I think what makes methamphetamine particularly so appealing is that it's a powerful dissociative drug, right? I remember one client saying, I take meth, I have 8 hours of bulletproof happiness. I just like step out of my life and the shame and the burdens and the problems and the worries, and I'm carefree. And I think that magic bubble is pretty appealing if you're in this kind of dark, heavy, same place. And so I think it's a really powerful motivation to do the drugs, which is why I think we really have to address shame. And I think a lot of guys, that's where this conversation came about. A lot of guys saying, "Why are we talking about shame? I have no shame." But yeah, I think it is there if we start to look at it, because they're just not really seeing it or recognizing it.
Yeah, when I do my share, I say crystal meth gave me wings but took away the sky. It really is that in working with this community and being able to have the privilege of working side by side with Mell every day, where what we found with our clients is looking at arousal templates around sex, looking at this internalized homonegativity or an internalized homophobia, looking at the family dynamic, looking at the way that we were raised. There are so many different factors that contribute to the escalation of crystal meth addiction and how it pertains to having sex fused together. I think that we've been able to really address some of the underlying things while looking at, the lifestyle that's associated with crystal meth, which is normally digital. And so do you feel, and I know how Mell feels, but just for our listeners, do you feel like when you're working with your clients that you look at some sort of digital detox in conjunction at the same time that you're looking at trying to get sober from crystal meth? Or how do you feel about the apps and all of that?
That's always the hot topic, right? It's like, can I ever use the app again? Well,
Yeah, I'm a believer in a digital detox and a period of sexual abstinence as well. And people hit back at me at that. I
Same.
remember one guy over in Europe telling me, basically, you're dooming, condemning gay men to a life of no sex, vanilla sex, boring sex. And well, no, not necessarily, right? Believe it or not, there was gay sex life before the apps came out.
Right.
In fact, I often joke about we should do courses on old-fashioned cruising or hanky codes or something
Right?
to bring awareness back. But no, I think the apps, for all kinds of reasons, are really, really triggering. First of all, they're designed to be triggering.
Yep.
They're really smart people, neurobiologists and scientists who know exactly how that reward circuitry works in the brain and know how to appeal to it, know how to keep us engaged. And, instead of selling widgets, as the same algorithms are used for, it keeps our eyeballs on that looking for sex and hookups. And it's very destructive.
I was reading this article about how a lot of app designs were created from slot machines.
Yeah.
Right? The creators of slot machines actually had influence in the creation of these digital platforms and using like ludic loops and just that intermittent reinforcement where,
Exactly.
miss. Oh, one hit. Miss, one hit. Like, so it keeps you engaged in the same way that a gambling addict would sit at a slot machine and spend their entire life savings. And this is a different type of life savings that's being spent because the spiritual, emotional, psychological consequences are just as dire, right? As like someone, a gambler that might lose money, you're losing self-esteem. You know, you're in the compare and despair. Your body image issues might be completely amplified. And then there's also, you know, there's racism, there's homophobia, there's xenophobia, like all of these things show up in these platforms. And I always find it really funny because I'm like, would you ever say that to a person that you just met on the street? No. But when you hide behind a screen, it's almost like a pass to say whatever you want to anybody. The no fats, no femmes, like all of those plugs. It's kind of like, what are we doing as a community to address this issue? Because this is insidious and this is destroying the relationships we have with one another and trust, right? Because if I see someone on an app and, you know, they're saying all these things and then, yeah, you know, 6 months down the line, I meet them in person, I do not trust you.
Yeah.
I know how you behave. Like it really has impeded intimacy, I think, in so many different ways in our community.
And in many ways, it promotes kind of this alternate persona, if you will, right? I think that also undermines a lot of the integrity of some recovery groups, because I
Yeah.
know there's a lot of people that go to meetings and claim sobriety, but then they're visible on the apps. They're out partying. They're not, you know, living the life they say they are. And it's just kind of, and people walk easily between these very two different worlds. Um, and the apps are constructed like you said, Mel, not only with those the feedback loops and all that, but done to color and
Yeah.
ringtones and all this stuff designed to kind of bypass our rational brain and go right to that limbic brain
Right.
and keep it hooked. Um, so yeah, no, I to a long way of answering your question, but yeah, I think that we need to have a break. Can people go back? I think that's not for me to say. I think people have to kind of pick their path at some point,
Yeah.
but it's a dangerous one. I think it
Right.
can be dangerous anyway.
In early recovery, yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think there's other like softer ones that, you know, the more PG apps where you actually have to have a conversation with someone before there's an
Yeah.
exchange of like pics. And I think that there is maybe a soft way to start to integrate those things back into your life after a period of time. But you mentioned, you know, I wanted to touch on this, David, because I know you do a lot of work internationally. Especially around the chemsex scene. And I just have so much curiosity around the global issue and the global problem. And I mean, are there certain parts of the world that you're seeing are disproportionately affected by this? Is there, I know some countries it's just wildly legal, but I'm just curious about your work on the international front.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So Europe has been really in the depths of this for about 10 years. We can almost pinpoint the day. I got called by a group called Mainline in Amsterdam to do some consultation work for them in like 2015 or 16. And they could almost pinpoint the day in 2014 when meth arrived from the UK,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Oh,
And
wow.
and it exploded. And then it quickly moved all over Europe and then into Eastern Europe. And that's where we're seeing the big growth right now. In fact, a lot of the cartels are trying to take over the meth supply in Europe, but it's your meth is coming out of Eastern Europe there, and a lot of we had a correspondence with a guy, believe it or not, in Kiev, a young gay man, and there's some gay club in war-torn Kiev, Ukraine, who's using meth. I mean, it's all across. I do a Tuesday night group like your Thursday group, and I have a lot of guys from India. I have people from China, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, Beijing.
Yeah.
I mean, so this is a worldwide problem.
Right.
I'm part of what Ben Collins was part of uh, our Chemsex summit recently. He does a lot of international work and coordination. I'm part of a group there, and it's an emerging problem in South America and Africa. I mean, it's taking off. Unfortunately, all over the world. It's like this momentum that we can't seem to stop. And at least in the West, you know, we have resources to deal with it. A lot of the parts of the world have just no knowledge, no training, no capacity to
Yeah.
intervene.
Yeah.
So it's really a bad situation.
Yeah.
It's exploding.
Right. And would it be fair to say that like I have worked with a couple of people, you know, that work in controlling chemsex and things like that.
Mhm.
They take a much more harm reduction approach to treating addiction than we do here in the States. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. I There's a conference I go to in Norway most years, but they're orientated. It's called Chem Friendly is the organizer, right? It's a harm reduction group promoting harm reduction, safe chemsex use. So they incorporate a lot of sex workers, which is an important
That
fact,
is
I think, to
important.
include them because there's a often underserved population and that's sort of underrepresented at least. But yeah, that was a couple of years of conversation before they kind of realized that at least they kind of bought into my perspective, which is that this is a continuum, right?
Right.
And for people at certain levels of engagement with chemsex, harm reduction is a great, tool. Um, but at some point, a percentage of those users enter what I call problematic use.
Yeah.
And that's not everybody. And I think one of the criticisms that's valid about less men and meth is I was kind of very black and white about stuff. And it's a little grayer than that. But I think there are people that cross that line. And at that point, I don't know that we're doing them any good service to promote harm reduction. If clearly they've lost control and need to do some other
The wheels are off the wagon. Harm reduction isn't
Exactly.
really going to help that.
Exactly.
I mean, I wish I could use meth like a gentleman.
It just,
I think that, my using quickly escalated. And I completely understand that 12 steps is not for everybody. That's what worked for me. We've discussed this topic before on the podcast that, I completely understand that abstinence is not for everyone. Working in this industry at first, when I heard about harm reduction, I didn't really understand the benefits of it. And I kind of, and my first initial thought was like, gosh, that's dangerous. However, in doing my research and working in the field and aligning with different organizations that are harm reduction based, I do very much see the value in harm reduction. And I think there's an appropriate person for that model. I wish I don't wish, but like it would have been great in my using if I could have picked up on a Thursday, put it down on a Sunday and gone to work on Monday. That's just not my story. I, do a bump and wake up and it's Christmas. That's just how my addiction works. And I remember, walking down the street one time and I was like, oh, there's Christmas decorations out. Gosh, it's December. And I was in coochie cutters and a tank top and flip flops, it's just, but I do very much see the value in harm reduction. And I do think that it's a very smart option to be able to reduce harm.
right. If someone's in pre-contemplation and like they're kind of just been staying there for the majority of their use, like harm reduction is a good avenue for someone like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it works. And again, it depends on where the person is at.
Right.
And also, to some extent, what their goals for themselves are, right? And I think we have to kind of start where the client is, but sometimes there's a big mismatch between where the client thinks they are and
And what
the
we're
rest of the
seeing.
world sees.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think
But,
the other component that really does impact it is mental health, right? And I think that, we've talked about this before as well, as like when, methamphetamine is much stronger than it ever has been before. And so, what we're seeing in the field is that the psychosis is much more instantaneous and much more acute and much longer than it was in previous years. And so, I think that, untreated mental health diagnosis, because a lot of people are using crystal meth so that they don't necessarily have to feel the effects of some of their mental health conditions, whether it's anxiety, depression, PTSD, or trauma. And then, when they're up for a certain point, it exacerbates the symptoms. And then, then we're looking at, not only are we looking at severe use, but also untreated mental health.
Which has been amplified because they've been,
amplified.
chronically using a very powerful stimulant. So, I love that you touched on like the potency, right? And like the psychiatric features that are showing up more and more. I mean, a person would use, and maybe once out of every 5 uses, they would be a little paranoid or a little suspicious. That is not what we're seeing at all. People are instantaneously having hallucinations, whether they're visual or auditory. and their aggression. Actually, I wanted to ask you about this. I've noticed a lot more aggression showing up than
Yeah.
ever before, and that's new because usually it was isolation and depression, and now we've kind of graduated to this kind of aggression along with like paranoia and other symptoms.
I think a lot of it is due to the fact that we're calling it meth, but it's not the same drug
Right.
as 20 years ago.
Right.
Right. After the cartels took over the manufacturer, they revised this P2P method and they use a different precursor. They don't use pseudoephedrine anymore. It's a different drug and it's much more toxic. And so we're seeing, and now it's about 95% of the supply in the United States.
Right.
And
Wow.
so chances are you're going to get it. And we're seeing these weird symptoms we never saw before, massive memory loss, like huge
Right.
blackouts. With the exception of Paulo waking up at Christmas, we didn't see too much before. Um, or this body rigidity thing where people are like frozen in place
Frozen, yes, the
for
frozenness.
3 hours. And to your point, Mel, also about the psychosis, this incredibly harsh and strong and persistent psychosis. And there's now a direct line. There's a lot of research talking about methamphetamine as this kind of gateway to schizophrenia.
Yeah.
If people are vulnerable to bipolar or schizophrenia, anything that has a manic phase in it, and what we call the prodromal phase, right? The phase before active symptoms start to emerge. So in other words, they're kind of vulnerable to it anyway, but this hastens the experience and people becoming actively schizophrenic sooner and more often than before. So there's a lot of really serious stuff going on with this that, and there's no research to speak of, and probably going to be worse these days. So I don't know. It's a scary time. But that's one thing I always try to, and it's been around long enough. I've lived through some of the fear-based prevention campaigns for methamphetamine, which don't work. None of that works because with meth particularly, and there was a task force here in South Florida 25 years ago that distributed a palm card with a skull on it and kind of little arrows of all the things that meth does to you, and it rots your teeth and ruins your brain and blah blah blah. And all it did was make meth users feel worse about themselves and go in the closet about it. They didn't stop. They couldn't, right? But it just increased the stigma both from the community and within the individual. So we need to kind of sharpen our messages in that sense. But I don't know how to approach this because it's a scary, very fear-based experience, but that's not enough. Knowing that, because meth, the urge to use meth comes out of that emotional part of the brain, and when we're talking about these things and prevention messages, we're talking about the rational part of the
That's
brain,
right.
right?
Yeah.
And that has no power against the emotional brain when that kicks in and wants meth. So we can do a lot more work, I think, in that in terms of outreach and support.
Yeah, I remember in early sobriety when I would hear the grinder noise, my stomach would rumble. It would be that I would have that connection to the sounds that the app made, where I would have a physical reaction in my body to something that was associated with my using.
Right.
And
I think we've talked about that before. There's a reason for that, right? Like it's
Yeah, like I mean, anything that this is my suggestion. Anything that's on your Chemsex arousal template, what type of porn was playing in the background, what app you're using, what website, what jockstrap you're wearing, what toys, like that needs to go in a box and be put on a shelf for like 18 months to 2 years, while you let your arousal template kind of reset. Right, a period of abstinence. Let's reset it and do some deep dives around like sexual recovery. Because I think, the tummy rumbles, yes, there's an association, and that's definitely the injury that starts to happen, right? Is like when you come into recovery, your visual cues, your visual memory, all of those things are really heightened. So if you have someone coming in 7 days and they're right back on Grindr, I can guarantee that they're probably going to relapse within a week, right? Because you have no impulse control as well. So you have your visual memory, sensory cues, and no impulse control. So extracting those things from your life is really important, I think, especially in the beginning phases, to not trigger that chemsex arousal template, right? Would you kind of agree
We-
on that point, David?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's a really overwhelming experience, I think, because not only is it all the sensory stuff, but it can be, streets,
Right.
buildings, times of day, Friday night,
Light
when
colors.
when you get a
Like,
direct deposit in
yeah,
your bank
anything.
account.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I think because meth produces like more dopamine than like anything on earth, dopamine is that's where associations are made, right?
Right.
Dopamine, Pavlov's dog, right?
Mm.
That's all about dopamine with associating the bell and getting food. And we learn very quickly because there's huge amounts of dopamine, very quickly all these associations get kind of gelled around the experience. And so all of those then can be triggers when we're trying to stay away from the experience.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
And
And
what
then with the 2 year window, I think people would probably go, oh,
Yeah.
but I think that's probably accurate.
I
in terms of
mean,
just
I
extinguishing those
yeah.
cues.
It's like that's the real. Like the time that it takes for the brain to heal is not going to heal in 90 days, and it's not going to heal in 6 months. And I think the most important gift you can give yourself is a gift of time when you're in recovery.
Totally.
Time and attention.
And as a
Yeah.
crystal meth addict, I love instant gratification.
Of course.
And so there's that, I want, and then we have, we have people that, and I'm guilty of this. When I got sober, I wanted my big, beautiful life back like this. And I thought that, like I'm sober, I'm doing the deal, I'm going to meetings, I'm calling my sponsor, I'm going to fellowship, I'm being of service, I'm in treatment, I'm in sober living, and 3 months later, I'm like, where's my big, beautiful life? And, that instant gratification piece for me really did trip me up in the beginning because I got, I wanted to get my life back together as quick as I was able to get high on crystal meth, and it just wasn't a reality. I wanted to go back to something that we were talking about, just this whole conversation around arousal templates and sex and positive language and positive reinforcement and just the proprietary knowledge that I think the two of you really have as it relates to chemsex. That is why I'm so passionate about the work that we do, because I feel like when clients or when gay men are looking for treatment and they end up in a LGBT friendly program, quote unquote, this knowledge is not common knowledge among clinicians. And so, when someone is seeking treatment for this specific condition and they end up going to a program that may say that they're familiar with this topic, I feel like, for some people it may work, but I think that, going to a specialist that specializes in this sort of chemical addiction, physical addiction, process addiction, digital addiction. I mean, it really is like
It's the intersection of everything and everything. It's kind of what it is, right?
And so I think finding the right specialist, and I know that both of you have free groups that are open to the community. That I think David, yours is on Tuesday, and Mel's yours is on Thursday.
Yeah.
When we're posting this, I hope that y'all don't mind. We could post it in the chat, because I feel like just having these resources available to the community is really important. With this being Pride Month and all the parties are happening and people are looking for resources and all of those things, I think that, I would love to be able to just scream as many resources as I can from the rooftops, because when I got sober, I didn't know where the hell to go.
Right.
And, to your point, Paula, one of my big gripes is that the training for people that work in our field is so siloed that, a lot of people never get exposure to any kind of sexual training, or a lot of addiction specialists don't know how to do a good sexual history, or certainly probably have never done their own kind of work on sexual issues. And so they're not comfortable talking about it with clients.
It's usually very taboo.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, even shutting down stuff in group, they're afraid to kind of intervene. But I've had a lot of clients come to me who had been kind of damaged or injured by previous therapeutic experiences where the staff wasn't sufficiently prepared to have these intense conversations about sex and drugs and things like skewed arousal templates where that leads us sometimes, and into those darker corners of our community. And just so I think doing that preparation is essential, and I don't think we do a very good job preparing the workforce, if you will, which makes places like No Matter What and a few others, very few others around the country, so important because you are prepared to deal with this in a way that has a lot of competency, and affirmation is not going to hurt people. More to the point.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, the
You're
other
not
thing,
going to further damage.
yeah, and the other thing for me is like it's also the community of people that you're in groups with, because in the environment that I went to, it was very bro-y and it was full of kind of like this toxic masculinity, and I didn't feel comfortable discussing hooking up in a bathhouse, being HIV positive, and being a gay sex worker. I didn't feel comfortable talking about that in that kind of environment, and so promoting, yes, being culturally competent and understanding, the world of chemsex when you're facilitating as a professional and doing, evidence-based therapeutic modalities to treat all of that. I think it's also the group of individuals that you're going to groups with, because if you feel like you're not comfortable enough to share that in that kind of group setting, because there comes that shame piece, then you're not going to talk about these important things, and we see that a lot when clients end up at No Matter What. They're finally like, oh my gosh, this is the first place I've been able to talk.
I can take a
about
breath,
this.
right? Yeah.
And that speaks highly of you guys because you're creating the safety, and I think it's up to us to do that in whatever milieu we happen to be in, to make it safe for clients to confess or feel free to talk about secrets and things they've held closely all their lives.
Yeah. And I just want to give a shout out because I swear I am on a rampage for people to start talking about sex and treatment. I'm like, we need groups on sexual health. We need groups on sexual recovery. And it is the most underserved topic in treatment, yet holds the highest relapse risk.
It's the central topic. So in chemsex treatment, right? Absolutely.
I'm like, come on. Like, and even other treatment centers that maybe aren't specific to chemsex, like sex and relationships are a huge part
Sex and love.
Sex and love. Like, these are really huge parts of people's lives. And the first thing that you reach for when you're sober is another person. Like, we know that, right? And that's going to come up. And if we as clinicians aren't actually talking about that, then we are not serving our client in the best way that we could. And I'm like, sex and romance. Like, we need a financial group and we need a sex and relationship
What's
group.
funny is Mel says finance and romance, and I say dick and dope. I mean, it's like, it's the two things. But and I'm going to get off my soapbox with this, and I'm not going to get into this whole thing. But private insurance doesn't cover normally treatment for sex.
No.
It's not something that they are, willing to see as something that they're going to cover in.
I think sexual compulsivity was just recently added to the DSM-5 in the last few years. Like, before then, it wasn't even in there.
Right, and anything like sex addiction is not.
Oh,
yet,
that's
right?
that's
under study.
Yeah.
The ICD has it, but so that's what they can point to and say, well, it's not, in the manual. Boy, it is. It's all over in the behavior and affects everything else.
Yeah, totally.
Especially when it comes to other kinds of addiction.
Yeah.
And we see, and this is another thing besides just snooping around for sexual issues with our clients, we need to look at other addictions, right? Gambling, kleptomania, food, work, all these things that people substitute. I call it whack-a-mole. Right? We treat one part of the addiction, but then they just jump to something else. But we're never dealing with what's underneath that's driving the whole brain.
Yeah.
Even with, almost 10 years sober, I see it whether it's with food or the gym or shopping or something, it's always looking for something, because I have the ism, right? I mean, I'm very clear in that ism is something that I possess. To wrap up, David, in the celebration of Pride Month and I really, I'm in this reflective state in the month of June, because I'm now of the mindset of like, I really want to honor the people that came before me and fought and lost their friends and their partners, and that have just been around and live these, experiences in order for me to be able to live the big, beautiful life that I have today. So I really want to just say thank you. I mean, I really, you have really just built, you crawled so I could walk, and when I say you, I mean your generation. And so, I'm just so grateful for the work that you've done professionally, but also just as being a queer man that has been through one of the most challenging times of, you know, of time, you know. I'm
Thank you. I
trying to figure
appreciate
out the best, most beautiful way to say it, and I can't, put it into words, but thank you. Yeah.
it. I hear it.
If you
And there are a
have
lot
any
of people out
advice
there.
for any gay men out there,
Yeah.
and what would it be?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If you had any advice for any gay men out there that
Okay,
are
I didn't know the
struggling,
first part.
any queer people,
Yeah,
any gay men, anyone struggling out there, what would it be?
I think especially in these times when there's a lot more oppression coming at us,
Mm.
I think to really get our internal sense of priorities right. And that means self-care. It means taking care of people we love. It means taking care of our community and speaking up. I think sometimes damaged goods piece of the unworthy, all those negative core belief stuff that can inhibit us and really hold us back from really embracing our power. I think one thing I learned kind of over a long, slow haul is that the power in this, right? It's an agency and a situation that I found myself in at a certain time and place in gay history, right? And of course, we're not power. We don't have power over, but we have a lot more power than we think. And I would encourage people to really find their voice and find each other and this community, because that we can kind of. This is one of those moments. I really. It feels like the '80s to me. It's one of those moments when we can kind of step up or not.
Yeah.
And I encourage everybody to really, pride. When you talk about pride before, pride to me is always like lubes and alcohol. It's like, how did little packets of lube and alcohol come to represent gay pride? But it
Yeah.
seems to have, at least here. But it's a lot, obviously a lot more about more than that. Maybe to reflect on the real issues here,
Yeah.
where we've come, and we've come
So far.
we have so much to lose too if we're not careful.
Yeah.
Just to really find their inner core of resilience and keep going forward.
Awesome. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Thank you. Mel, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting that. Okay. what I mean, I guess if there's anything I want to say to my community, it's speak up and speak out. And if you feel like you're on the outside of the community, come in. Because I see like a lot of like kind of people that are siloed in their little intersections of communities. But right now, I think we need a huge community call to action and to come together and to come in, to hold one another, to listen to one another, to speak for each other, for those that can't find their voice yet or don't know the words to say. I think now more than ever, we really need to come together in a way that we haven't seen before. And there's so many more people who are out these days and living those lives and loving those lives. And I want to see people continue to live and love those lives. But that's what's at stake right now. And so I think, whether it's joining a Zoom call, a Facebook community group, an Instagram group, and starting to create these little subsets that can help us, like, just fight for what we believe in and come back to a place of our own humanity and see one another as friends, not competition. So I think that is the thing I would like to say. Like, if you're on the outside, come in. It's warm. We got a space for you.
I love it. Yeah. I think for me, I would love to speak to all of the individuals out there who feel like there is not a solution to their habitual using of methamphetamine or crystal meth. And what I can say is from experience, from someone that had every card stacked against them, I couldn't pull a needle out of my neck long enough to be able to see reality. Like, there is a big, beautiful life available, and there is life beyond addiction to crystal meth.
Yeah.
And you will be able to have great sex. You will be able to have beautiful relationships. You will be able to walk in a room with your head held high and look people in the eyes again. You will be able to navigate life in a way that is beautiful, and it is possible. And I just would love to reinforce, that's not the greatest word, but to reiterate what you said. We are all just like one big community, and I think that it's a troubling time with everything that's going on politically and in the media and within our community. And so I think it's conversations like these that get to move the narrative along. And when we post this video online and all of our streaming platforms, we'll make sure to put the links in for both of your groups and any sort of public resources that people may have that are, anywhere in the country that may not have access to these resources that we have. We'll post it. So
Yeah, definitely. So look in the link for the resources, because there's so many free available resources. It's not, and if you're just on the edge of it, like, drop into Dr. Fawcett's group or drop into my group and like see what's going on and check it out.
Yes, there's so much fear out there, right? People are really afraid for all kinds of reasons. And I think in the 80s, the darkest time, the strongest buddy system I've ever experienced in my life, right? People checked on each other. That encourages us to reach out to people we may have heard of or may think might be a little bit in shock or not wanting to be too public or forward. Check on them. Let's check on each other. Let's be a community that supports.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and thank you for all of our listeners, and thank you to Mel for joining me. And please, please, please like and subscribe, and we can't wait to see you next week on the No Matter What Club. Happy Pride.
Yay. Thanks so much, David.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Awesome.
Loved being here.
Thanks.